Section 15 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 3, Ancient Achievements, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Military Art, Part 2. The main dependence of the legion was on the infantry, which wore heavy armor consisting of helmet, breastplate, greaves on the right leg, and on the left arm a buckler, 4 feet in length and 2½ in width. The helmet was originally made of leather or untanned skin, strengthened and adorned by bronze or gold, and surmounted by a crest which was often of horsehair, and so made as to give an imposing look. The crests served not only for ornament, but to distinguish the different centurions. The breastplate or cuirass was generally made of metal, and sometimes was highly ornamented. Chain mail was also used. The greaves were of bronze or brass, with a lining of leather or felt, and reached above the knees. The shield worn by the heavily armored infantry was not round, like that of the early Greeks, but oval or oblong, adapted to the shape of the body, such as was adopted by Philip and Alexander, and was made of wood or wicker work. The weapons were a light spear, a pilum or javelin over 6 feet long, terminated by a steel point, and a short cut and thrust sword with a double edge. Besides the armor and weapons of the legionary, he usually carried on the marches provisions for 2 weeks, 3 or 4 stakes used in forming the palisade of the camp, beside various tools, altogether a burden of 60 or 80 pounds per man. The legion was drawn up 8 deep, and 3 feet intervened between rank and file, which disposition gave great activity, and made it superior to the Macedonian phalanx, the strength of which depended on 16 ranks of long pikes wedged together. The general period of service for the infantry was 20 years, after which the soldier received a discharge, together with a bounty in money or land. The cavalry attached to each legion consisted of 300 men, who originally were selected from the leading men in the state. They were mounted at the expense of the state, and formed a distinct order. The cavalry was divided into 10 squadrons. To each legion was attached also a train of 10 military engines of the largest size, and 55 of the smaller, all of which discharged stones and darts with great effect. This train corresponded with our artillery. The Roman legion, whether it was composed of 4,000 men, as in the early ages of the Republic, or 6,000, as in the time of Augustus, was divided into 10 cohorts, and each cohort was composed of hastati, raw troops, principes, trained troops, tirarii, veterans, and velites, light troops or skirmishers. The soldiers of the first line, called hastati, consisted of youths in the bloom of manhood, who were distributed into 15 companies or maniples. Each company contained 60 privates, 2 centurions, and a standard bearer. 2/3 were heavily armed, and bore the long shield; the remainder carried only a spear and light javelins. The second line, the principes, was composed of men in the full vigor of life, divided also into 15 companies, all heavily armed, and distinguished by the splendor of their equipments. The third body, the triarii, was composed of tried veterans in 15 companies, the least trustworthy of which were placed in the rear. These formed 3 lines. The velites were light armed troops employed on outpost duty, and mingled with the horsemen. The hastati were so called because they were armed with the hasta, or spear; the principes for being placed so near to the front; and the triarii from having been arrayed behind the first 2 lines as a body of reserve. The triarii were armed with the pilum, thicker and stronger than the Grecian lance, 4½ feet long, of wood, with a barbed head of iron, so that the whole length of the weapon was 6 feet 9 inches. It was used either to throw or thrust with, and when it pierced the enemy's shield, the iron head was bent, and the spear, owing to the twist in the iron, still held to the shield. Each soldier carried 2 of these weapons, and threw the heavy pilum over the heads of their comrades in front, in order to break the enemy's lines. In the time of the Empire, when the legion was modified, the infantry wore cuirasses and helmets, and carried a sword and dagger. The select infantry were armed with a long spear and a shield, the rest with a pilum. Each man carried a saw, a basket, a mattock, a hatchet, a leather strap, a hook, a chain, and provision for 3 days. The equites (cavalry) wore helmets and cuirasses like the infantry, having a broadsword at the right side, and in the hand a long pole. A buckler swung at the horse's flank. They were also furnished with a quiver containing 3 or 4 javelins. The artillery were used both for hurling missiles in battle and for the attack on fortresses. The tormentum, which was an elastic instrument, discharged stones and darts, and was held in general use until the discovery of gunpowder. In besieging a city, the ram was employed for destroying the lower part of a wall, and the ballista, which discharged stones, was used to overthrow the battlements. The ballista would project a stone weighing from 50 to 300 pounds. The Ares, or battering ram, consisted of a large beam made of the trunk of a tree, frequently 100 feet in length, to one end of which was fastened a mace of iron or bronze resembling in form the head of a ram. It was often suspended by ropes from a beam fixed transversely over it, so that the soldiers were relieved from supporting its weight, and were able to give it a rapid and forcible swinging motion back and forth. When this machine was further perfected by rigging it upon wheels, and constructing over it a roof, so as to form a testudo, which protected the besieging party from the assaults of the besieged, there was no tower so strong, no wall so thick, as to resist a long continued attack, the great length of the beam enabling the soldiers to work across the defensive ditch, and as many as 100 men being often employed upon it. The Romans learned from the Greeks the art of building this formidable engine, which was used with great effect by Alexander, but with still greater by Titus in the siege of Jerusalem. It was first used by the Romans in the siege of Syracuse. The vinea was a sort of roof under which the soldiers protected themselves when they undermined walls. The Heliopolis, also used in the attack on cities, was a square tower furnished with all the means of assault. This also was a Greek invention, and the one used by Demetrius at the siege of Rhodes, B.C. 306, was 135 feet high and 68 wide, divided into 9 stories. The turris, a tower of the same class, was used both by Greeks and Romans, and even by Asiatics. Mithridates used one at the siege of Cyzicus, 150 feet in height. These most formidable engines were generally made of beams of wood covered on 3 sides with iron and sometimes with rawhides. They were higher than the walls and all other fortifications of a besieged place, and divided into stories pierced with windows. In and upon them were stationed archers and slingers, and in the lower story was a battering ram. The soldiers in the turris were also provided with scaling ladders, sometimes on wheels, so that when the top of the wall was cleared by means of the turris, it might be scaled by means of the ladders. It was impossible to resist these powerful engines except by burning them, or by undermining the ground upon which they stood, or by overturning them with stones or iron shod beams hung from a mast on the wall, or by increasing the height of the wall, or by erecting temporary towers on the wall beside them. Thus there was no ancient fortification capable of withstanding a long siege when the besieged city was short of defenders or provisions. With forces equal between the combatants, an attack was generally a failure, for the defenders had always a great advantage. But when the number of defenders was reduced, or when famine pressed, the skill and courage of the assailants would ultimately triumph. Some ancient cities made a most obstinate resistance, like Tarentum, like Carthage, which stood a siege of 4 years, like Numantia in Spain, and like Jerusalem. When cities were of immense size, population, and resources, like Rome when besieged by Alaric, it was easier to take them by cutting off all ingress and egress, so as to produce famine. Tyre was taken by Alexander only by cutting off the harbor. Cyrus could not have taken Babylon by assault, since the walls were of such enormous height, and the ditch was too wide for the use of battering rams. He resorted to an expedient of which the blinded inhabitants of that doomed city never dreamed, which rendered their impregnable fortifications useless. Nor probably would the Romans have prevailed against Jerusalem had not famine decimated and weakened its defenders. Fortified cities, though scarcely ever impregnable, were yet more in use in ancient than modern times, and greatly delayed the operations of advancing armies. And it was probably the fortified camp of the Romans, which protected an army against surprises and other misfortunes, that gave such permanent efficacy to the legions. The chief officers of the legion were the tribunes, and originally there was one in each legion from the 3 tribes, the Ramnes, Luceres, and Tities. In the time of Polybius, the number in each legion was 6. Their authority extended equally over the whole legion, but to prevent confusion it was custom for them to divide into 3 sections of 2, and each pair undertook the routine duties for 2 months out of 6. They nominated the centurions, and assigned each to the company to which he belonged. These tribunes at first were chosen the commanders in chief by the kings and consuls, but during the palmy days of the Republic, when the patrician power was preeminent, they were elected by the people, that is, the citizens. Later they were named, half by the Senate and half by the consuls. No one was eligible to this great office who had not served 10 years in the infantry or 5 in the cavalry. The tribunes were distinguished by their dress from the common soldier. Next in rank to the tribunes, who corresponded to the rank of brigadiers and colonels in our times, were the centurions, of whom there were 60 in each legion, men who were more remarkable for calmness and sagacity than for courage and daring valor, men who would keep their posts at all hazards. It was their duty to drill the soldiers, to inspect arms, clothing, and food, to visit the sentinels and regulate the conduct of the men. They had the power of inflicting corporal punishment. They were chosen for merit solely until the later ages of the empire, when their posts were bought, as is the case to some extent to day in the English army. The centurions were of unequal rank, those of the triarii before those of the principes, and those of the principes before those of the hastati. The first centurion of the first maniple of the triarii stood in rank next to the tribunes, and had a seat in military councils. His office was very lucrative. To his charge was entrusted the eagle of the legion. As a centurion might rise from the ranks by regular gradation through the different maniples of the hastati, principes, and triarii, there was great inducement held out to the soldiers. It would, however, appear that the centurion received only twice the pay of the ordinary legionary. There was not therefore so much difference in rank between a private and a captain as there is in our day. There were no aristocratic distinctions in the ancient world so marked as those existing in the modern. In the Roman legion there was nevertheless a regular gradation of rank, although there were but few distinct offices. The gradation was determined not by length of service, but for merit alone, of which the tribunes were the sole judges. Hence the tribune in a Roman legion had more power than that of a modern colonel. As the tribunes named the centurions, so the centurions appointed their lieutenants, who were called subcenturions. Still below these were 2 sub-officers, or sergeants, and the decanus, or corporal, to every 10 men. There was a change in the constitution and disposition of the legion after the time of Marius, until the fall of the Republic. The legions were thrown open to men of all grades; they were all armed and equipped alike; the lines were reduced to 2, with a space between every 2 cohorts, of which there were 5 in each line. The young soldiers were placed in the rear; the distinction between hastati, principes, and terrarii ceased. The velites disappeared, their work being done by the foreign mercenaries; the cavalry ceased to be part of the legion, and became a distinct body; and the military was completely severed from the rest of the State. Formerly no one could aspire to office who had not completed 10 years of military service, but in the time of Cicero a man could pass through all the great dignities of the State with a very limited experience of military life. Cicero himself did military service in but one campaign. Under the emperors there were still other changes. The regular army consisted of legions and supplementa, the latter being subdivided into the imperial guards and the auxiliary troops. The auxiliaries (socii) consisted of troops from the States in alliance with Rome, or those compelled to furnish subsidies. The infantry of the allies was generally more numerous than that of the Romans, while the cavalry was 3 times as numerous. All the auxiliaries were paid by the State; their infantry received the same pay as the Roman infantry, but their cavalry received only 2/3 of what was paid to the Roman cavalry. The common foot soldier received in the time of Polybius 3½ asses a day, equal to about 3 cents; the horsemen 3 times as much. The praetorian cohorts received twice as much as the legionaries. Julius Caesar allowed about 6 asses a day as the pay of the legionary, and under Augustus the daily pay was raised to 10 asses, little more than 8 cents per day. Domitian raised the stipend still higher. The soldier, however, was fed and clothed by the government. The praetorian cohort was a select body of troops instituted by Augustus to protect his person, and consisted of 10 cohorts, each of 1,000 men, chosen from Italy. This number was increased by Vitellius to 16,000, and they were assembled by Tiberius in a permanent camp, which was strongly fortified. They had peculiar privileges, and when they had served 16 years, received 20,000 sesterces, or more than £100 sterling. Each praetorian had the rank of a centurion in the regular army. Like the bodyguard of Louis XIV., they were all gentlemen, and formed gradually a great power, like the janissaries of Constantinople, and frequently disposed of the purple itself. Our notice of the Roman legion would be incomplete without some description of the camp in which the soldier virtually lived. A Roman army never halted for a single night without forming a regular intrenchment capable of holding all the fighting men, the beasts of burden, and the baggage. During the winter months, when the army could not retire into some city, it was compelled to live in the camp, which was arranged and fortified according to a uniform plan, so that every company and individual had a place assigned. We cannot tell when this practice of intrenchment began; it was matured gradually, like all other things pertaining to all arts. The system was probably brought to perfection during the wars with Hannibal. Skill in the choice of ground, giving facilities for attack and defence, and for procuring water and other necessities, was of great account with the generals. An area of about 5,000 square feet was allowed for a company of infantry, and 10,000 feet for a troop of 30 dragoons. The form of a camp was an exact square, the length of each side being 2,017 feet. There was a space of 200 feet between the ramparts and the tents to facilitate the marching in and out of soldiers, and to guard the cattle and booty. The principal street was 100 feet wide, and was called Principia. The defences of the camp consisted of a ditch, earth from which was thrown inward, and of strong palisades of wooden stakes driven into the top of the earthwork so formed. The ditch was sometimes 15 feet deep, and the vallum, or rampart, 10 feet in height. When the army encamped for the first time, the tribunes administered an oath to each individual, including slaves, to the effect that they would steal nothing out of the camp. Every morning at daybreak the centurions and the equites presented themselves before the tents of the tribunes, and the tribunes in like manner presented themselves before the praetorian to learn the orders of the consuls, which through the centurions were communicated to the soldiers. 4 companies took charge of the principal street to see it was properly cleaned and watered, 1 company took charge of the tent of the tribune, a strong guard attended to the horses, and another 50 men stood beside the tent of the general, that he might be protected from open danger and secret treachery. The velites mounted guard the whole night and day along the whole extent of the vallum, and each gate was guarded by 10 men. The equites were entrusted with the duty of acting as sentinels during the night, and most ingenious measures were adopted to secure their watchfulness and fidelity. The watchword for the night was given by the commander in chief. On the first signal being given by the trumpet, the tents were all struck and the baggage packed. At the second signal the baggage was placed upon the beasts of burden, and at the third the whole army began to move. Then the herald, standing at the right hand of the general, demands thrice if they are ready for war, to which they all respond with loud and repeated cheers that they are ready, and for the most part, being filled with martial ardor, anticipate the question, and raise their right hands on high with a shout. From what has come down to us of Roman military life, it appears to have been full of excitement, toil, danger, and hardship. The pecuniary rewards of the soldier were small; he was paid in glory. No profession brought so much honor as the military, and it was from the undivided attention of a great people to this profession that it was carried to all the perfection which could be attained before the great invention of gunpowder changed the art of war. It was not the number of men employed in the Roman armies which particularly arrests attention, but the genius of organization which controlled and the spirit which animated them. The Romans loved war, but so reduced it to a science that it required comparatively small armies to conquer the world. Sulla defeated Mithridates with only 30,000 men, while his adversary marshaled against him over 100,000. Caesar had only 10 legions to effect the conquest of Gaul, and none of these were of Italian origin. At the great decisive battle of Pharsalia, when most of the available forces of the empire were employed on one side or the other, Pompey commanded a legionary army of 45,000 men, and his cavalry amounted to 7,000 more, but among them were included the flower of the Roman nobility. The auxiliary force has not been computed, although it was probably numerous. In the same battle Caesar had under him only 22,000 legionaries and 1,000 cavalry. But every man in both armies was prepared to conquer or die. The forces were posted on the open plain, and the battle was really a hand-to-hand encounter, in which the soldiers, after hurling their lances, fought with their swords chiefly, and when the cavalry of Pompey rushed upon the legionaries of Caesar, no blows were wasted on the mailed panoply of the mounted Romans, but were aimed at the face alone, as that only was unprotected. The battle was decided by the coolness, bravery, and discipline of Caesar's veterans, inspired by the genius of the greatest general of antiquity. Less than 100,000 men, in all probability, were engaged in one of the most memorable conflicts which the world has seen. Thus it was by blended art and heroism that the Roman legions prevailed over the armies of the ancient world. But this military power was not gained in a say; it took nearly 200 years, after the expulsion of the kings, to regain supremacy over the neighboring people, and another century to conquer Italy. The Romans did not contend with regular armies until they were brought into conflict with the king of Epirus and the phalanx of the Greeks, which improved their military tactics, and introduced between the combatants those mutual regards of civilized nations which teach men to honor their adversaries, to spare the vanquished, and to lay aside wrath when the struggle is ended. After the consolidation of Roman power in Italy, it took but 150 years more to complete the conquest of the world. Of northern Africa, Spain, Gaul, Illyria, Epirus, Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, Pontus, Syria, Egypt, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Pergamus, and the islands of the Mediterranean. The conquest of Carthage left Rome without a rival in the Mediterranean, and promoted intercourse with the Greeks. The Illyrian wars opened to the Romans the road to Greece and Asia, and destroyed the pirates of the Adriatic. The invasion of Cisalpine Gaul, now that part of Italy which is north of the Apennines, protected Italy from the invasion of barbarians. The Macedonian war against Philip put Greece under the protection of Rome, and that against Antiochus laid Syria at her mercy. When these kingdoms were reduced to provinces, the way was opened to further conquests in the East, and the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. But these conquests introduced luxury, wealth, pride, and avarice, which degrade while they elevate. Successful war created great generals and founded great families, increased slavery and promoted inequalities. Meanwhile the great generals struggled for supremacy; civil wars followed in the train of foreign conquests. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Augustus sacrificed the State to their own ambitions. Good men lamented and protested, and hid themselves. Cato, Cicero, Brutus spoke in vain. Degenerate morals kept pace with civil contests. Rome revelled in the spoils of all kingdoms and countries, was intoxicated with power, became cruel and tyrannical, and after sacrificing the lives of citizens to fortunate generals, yielded at last her liberties, and imperial despotism began its reign. War had added empire, but undermined prosperity. It had created a great military monarchy, but destroyed liberty. It had brought wealth, but introduced inequalities. It had filled the city with spoils, but sown the vices of self interest. The machinery remained perfect, but life had fled. It henceforth became the labor of emperors to keep together their vast possessions with this machinery, which at last wore out, since there was neither genius to repair it nor patriotism to work it. It lasted 300 years, but was broken to pieces by the barbarians. Authorities. Wilkinson is the best authority pertaining to Egyptian armies. The highest authority in relation to the construction of an army is Polybius, contemporary with Scipio, when Roman discipline was most perfect. The 8th chapter of Livy is also very much prized. Salmasius and Lepsius wrote learned treatises. Tacitus, Sallust, Livy, Dion Cassius, Pliny, and Caesar reveal incidentally much that we wish to know, the last giving us the liveliest idea of the military habits and tactics of the Romans. Gibbon gives some important facts. The subject of ancient machines is treated by Fullard's commentary attached to his translation of Polybius. Josephus describes with great vividness the siege of Jerusalem. Smith's Dictionary of Antiquities is full of details in everything pertaining to the weapons, the armor, the military engines, the rewards and punishments of the soldiers. The articles Exertus in Smith's Dictionary and Army in the Encyclopaedia Britannica give a practical summary of the best writers. End of section 15.